buckle up everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into the world of Brisa.
Brisa.
Yeah, Brisa. It's this brand new web framework that's been making a ton of noise lately. It's built on Bun.js.
Ah, Bun.js. That JavaScript runtime that's been turning heads with its speed, right?
Exactly. And that speed is baked right into Brisa. But honestly, what really grabbed my attention is Brisa's ambition.
How so?
It's like they're looking at the entire web dev landscape and saying, why choose? Let's just do it all. Server-side rendering, static site generation, even desktop apps.
All in one framework. That's a pretty bold claim.
Yeah, and they're doing all this while still in those early experimental .x versions. It's kind of wild. But before we get lost in the hype, let's break down what makes Brisa tick. I know it borrows some ideas from familiar faces like Next.js and Solid.js.
It does. One of the first things you'll notice is that Brisa, like Next.js, uses file system routing. So you organize your project files, and bam, your routes are basically set up for you.
Okay, that's definitely a plus for keeping things organized. What about reactivity? I hear Brisa uses signals for that, similar to Solid.js.
You're right on the money. But here's where it gets interesting. Signals offer a potentially massive performance advantage over that virtual DOM approach used by frameworks like React.
Go on.
See, with Signals, you're only updating the specific parts of the UI that need to change rather than re-rendering entire components.
So it's like a laser-focused update instead of repainting the whole house every time you want to change a light bulb?
Perfect analogy. And the performance gains can be huge, especially in complex applications.
We talking like noticeable to the user kind of speed improvements?
Oh, absolutely. There are benchmarks showing Signals can be up to 10 times faster for certain update scenarios.
Wow, 10 times. That's insane. But hold on, most of Brisa runs on the server, right? That's different from a lot of frameworks that are heavily client-side focused.
Exactly. That server-side focus is another key differentiator for Brisa. It means most of the heavy lifting happens on the server, and the client receives pre-rendered HTML.
Makes sense. So less work for the browser to do, which means faster load times.
Precisely. Of course, there's the exception of Brisa's dedicated web components folder, which we'll dive into later.
Web components, huh? Another buzzword that's been making the rounds. We'll definitely have to unpack that one. But first, let's talk authentication. I mean, pretty much every web app needs some kind of login system these days.
You're not wrong, and Brisa gives you a whole buffet of authentication strategies to choose from.
Like what?
Well, you've got your Oath and OpenID Connect for using third-party providers like Google or Facebook.
Right.
Then there's traditional credential-based logins with email and passwords, passwordless options,
Oh, interesting.
even the cutting-edge passkeys using WebAuth.
Passkeys, that's one where you can log in with like your fingerprint or face scan, right?
That's the one. It's all about making authentication more secure and user-friendly. But, of course, the specific strategy you choose really depends on your project's needs and security requirements.
Makes sense. Now, once a user is logged in, how does Brisa keep track of their session? Cookies, databases, some kind of dark magic.
Haha. No dark magic involved, I promise. Brisa offers two main approaches for session tracking: cookie-based and database sessions. Cookie-based is simpler to set up, but can have some security implications if you're not careful.
And database sessions.
Database sessions give you more robust control and security, but require more server resources.
So it's a trade-off between simplicity and security. Got it. But what I really want to know is what kind of applications can you actually build with Brisa? Is it just for websites, or can you get more creative?
This is where Brisa's versatility really shines. You can use it to build traditional server-side rendered applications with Bun.js or Node.js.
Okay, so the classic web app setup.
Exactly. Then you've got blazing fast static sites.
Right.
And even get this, desktop applications for Windows, macOS, Linux, Android, and iOS.
Wait, desktop apps too? Seriously, how does that even work?
Brisa uses a toolkit called Tori for creating cross-platform desktop apps. It's pretty slick. You write your app logic in Brisa, and Tori packages it up into a standalone desktop app.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. Server-side rendering, static sites, desktop apps. It's like Brisa is the Swiss Army knife of web frameworks.
I think that's a pretty apt description. But wait, there's one more trick up Brisa's sleeve that I think you'll find particularly interesting.
Oh, do go.
It has this almost secret superpower. A web component compiler.
Now you're speaking my language. Web components have always intrigued me. Tell me more about how Brisa handles them.
Well, with Brisa, you can create web components that are reusable in any web project, no matter the framework. Think of it like crafting universal building blocks for the web.
So I could build a component in Brisa and use it in a React project, a Vue project, even just a plain old HTML site.
Exactly. You build it once, and you can use it anywhere. It's a powerful concept that has the potential to revolutionize how we build and share components across the web.
And Brisa is at the forefront of making that happen.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've established that Brisa is versatile, performant, and has some truly unique features. But let's put it in context. How does it stack up against the heavy hitters in the web framework world? Like, how does it compare to Next.js?
Yeah, good question. Next.js is kind of the reigning champ when it comes to React-based frameworks, right?
It is. And like Brisa, it uses that file system routing approach, which can make for a familiar development experience.
So organizationally, they're on the same page. But what about their approach to reactivity? Next.js uses a virtual DOM, right?
Right, but Brisa's signal-based approach is all about more granular and potentially more performant updates. Remember those benchmarks we talked about?
The 10x speed boost, yeah. So does that mean Brisa is always going to be faster than Next.js?
Not necessarily. Next.js has a massive ecosystem and a mature community, which are huge advantages. And it's been battle-tested in countless production applications.
True, it's tough to beat that kind of stability and support.
Mm.
Okay, let's move on to another contender, Solid.js, known for its raw speed, right? How does Brisa compare on that front?
Solid.js and Brisa actually share a common philosophy when it comes to reactivity. They both rely on signals.
So they're kind of like siblings, each with their own unique strengths.
I like that analogy. But a key difference lies in their typical use cases. Solid.js often excels in scenarios where you need intense client-side interactivity and lightning-fast updates, like in highly dynamic web apps.
And Brisa?
With its server-side rendering focus, Brisa leans more towards applications where initial load times and SEO are paramount. Think content-heavy websites, marketing pages, or e-commerce platforms.
Gotcha. Each has its sweet spot. Okay, one last framework to compare. Svelte. It's known for its compile time magic. Where does Brisa fit in here?
Svelte, like Brisa, is a champion of performance. But their approaches are quite different. Svelte compiles your code into highly optimized vanilla JavaScript, minimizing runtime overhead.
So it's all about squeezing every ounce of performance out of the code.
Exactly. Brisa, on the other hand, achieves its performance through server-side rendering and its use of signals. Plus, it offers that unique web component compiler we talked about.
So it seems like Brisa is really prioritizing flexibility and performance above all else.
I think that's a very astute observation. Brisa aims to give you the tools to build almost anything for the web. From lightning-fast static sites to complex desktop applications, all without compromising on speed. It's an ambitious goal.
It certainly is. But let's not forget that Brisa is still a young framework. It's exciting, but it's also a bit of an adventure for early adopters.
Very true. It's evolving rapidly and the community is growing, but it hasn't reached the maturity and stability of a framework like Next.js or React just yet.
So it's a trade-off. Cutting-edge features and potential for rapid growth versus the stability and support of a more established ecosystem.
Exactly.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive into Brisa. We've explored its core concepts, its unique features, and how it stacks up against some of the big players in the web framework world.
And there's still so much more to uncover.
There is.
Those signals we were talking about earlier, they're like the heart and soul of Brisa's reactivity system.
Yeah, those little data containers, right, the ones that can change over time.
Exactly. You got it. And the beauty of signals is that when their value changes, any part of your app using that signal updates automatically. No manual DOM manipulation needed.
That sounds way more efficient than the virtual DOM stuff I'm used to with React.
Yeah.
But does it actually translate to a noticeable performance difference for the user?
Oh, absolutely. Imagine a complex UI with tons of dynamic elements. With the traditional virtual DOM diffing, even a small change could trigger this whole cascade of re-renders.
Right.
But with signals, only the elements directly affected by that change actually update.
So it's like swapping out a single brick in a wall instead of rebuilding the whole thing.
Nailed it. It's a super powerful concept. And it's not just about speed either. Signals also tend to be more predictable and easier to reason about, which makes debugging a lot less painful.
Okay, I'm sold on the concept. But can you give me like a real-world example of how signals actually play out in a Brisa app?
Sure. Let's say you're building a real-time chat application. You could use a signal to store the list of messages.
Okay.
As new messages come in, you just update the signal and boom, the chat window reflects the changes automatically.
Ah, I see. So I wouldn't need to write a bunch of code to manually manipulate the DOM every time a new message arrives.
Nope. It just works. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Signals are used all over Brisa for managing component state, handling user input, all sorts of things.
Now let's switch gears a bit and talk about server components. You mentioned earlier that most of Brisa's logic runs on the server, but I'm still a little fuzzy on how that works in practice.
Sure, server components are kind of like the behind-the-scenes heroes of a Brisa app. They handle data fetching, business logic, anything that's best done in that server environment.
So they're keeping things clean and efficient by doing all the heavy lifting on the server.
Exactly. But here's the really clever part. When it comes time to render something in the UI, a server component doesn't send a bunch of JavaScript over to the client. It pre-renders that component into pure HTML and delivers it straight to the browser.
So the client basically receives a pre-assembled chunk of the UI.
Hmm.
No wonder Brisa apps load so quickly.
Right. It's all about minimizing that initial load time. Plus, this approach has some big SEO benefits.
Oh, how so?
Search engines love pre-rendered HTML. It makes it so much easier for them to crawl and index your site.
Okay, starting to see how the whole server-side rendering thing really pays off.
It does, but server components don't exist in a vacuum, right? We've also got web components on the client side handling the interactivity.
Right. So how do they work together?
Server components and web components work hand in hand through this mechanism called server actions.
Server actions, it sounds like a superhero team up.
It kind of is. Imagine a web component needs to trigger some logic on the server, right? Maybe the user clicks a button to submit a form.
Okay, I'm following.
That button click could trigger a server action, sending a request back to the server. The server processes the request, updates any relevant signals, and sends back the updated HTML. And the UI updates seamlessly without a full page reload.
So it's like a super fast conversation happening behind the scenes between the client and server.
Exactly, and it's a very efficient way to handle user interactions while keeping the UI snappy and responsive. All right, now let's finally tackle the mystery of web components in Brisa. You mentioned earlier you were intrigued by them.
I am. They've always seemed really powerful, but I've never quite grasped how they fit into the whole picture.
Well, the great thing about web components is that they're based on web standards. They're not tied to any specific framework.
Right.
This means you can build a web component in Brisa and use it in a React project, a Vue project, even just plain old HTML.
That's like the holy grail of component reusability. Write once, use everywhere.
Exactly. And Brisa makes it super easy to build these web components. You just create your component in this special web components folder, and Brisa takes care of the rest. It'll even bundle everything up into a standalone package that you can share.
So Breeze is giving me the tools to become like a web component artisan.
Haha, I like that. And keep in mind, these aren't just dumb, static chunks of HTML. Web components in Brisa have access to everything Brisa offers.
Yeah.
Signals, server actions, the whole shebang.
So they're like mini Brisa apps in their own right.
In a way, yeah. They can be as simple or as complex as you need them to be. And because they're built on those web standards, they're incredibly portable. You truly can build once and use anywhere. Now, there's one more nuance about web components in Brisa that I think is particularly clever.
All around me.
By default, Brisa applies server-side rendering to web components as well, which means they get that initial speed boost from being pre-rendered on the server.
Ah, so they get the best of both worlds. Server-side rendering and client-side interactivity.
You got it. But here's where it gets even more interesting. You can actually disable server-side rendering for specific web components if you need to.
Okay, when would you want to do that?
Let's say you have a web component that's only displayed after some user interaction, like a modal dialog.
Right. It wouldn't make sense to render that on the server if it's not initially visible.
Exactly. So you can use a special attribute to tell Brisa, hey, skip the server-side rendering for this one. It's all about fine-tuning performance and optimizing for the best user experience.
I'm really liking this attention to detail. Seems like they've thought of everything.
They really have. And that careful design carries over into how Brisa handles forms. Forms are obviously essential for so many web apps, but they can also be a huge source of complexity and frustration.
Tell me about it. I've spent way too many hours wrestling with form logic.
So Brisa supports both controlled and uncontrolled forms, but it actually encourages developers to favor uncontrolled forms whenever possible.
Uncontrolled forms. That sounds a little old school. I thought controlled forms were the go-to these days.
It might seem counterintuitive, but Brisa's approach makes a lot of sense when you consider its server-side rendering focus.
Okay. How so?
Well, with uncontrolled forms, the browser manages the form data initially. Then, when the form's submitted, that data gets sent up to the server for processing.
So it's minimizing the back and forth between the client and server.
You've got it. And it often simplifies the logic on both sides. Now, don't worry, you can still use controlled forms in Brisa if you need to, but the default approach is to keep things as simple as possible and leverage the browser's capabilities.
I like that philosophy.
Mm.
Sometimes the simplest solution is the best solution. Now, I know we've covered a ton of information here. Is there anything else you think is worth highlighting before we move on?
I think it's worth mentioning just how extensible Brisa is. It's got this really cool plugin system that even lets you customize the build process.
Plugins. That sounds like a pretty powerful way to tailor Brisa to your exact needs.
It is. These plugins can do some pretty amazing things. They can intercept imports, transpile code, even add support for new file types like .scss or .yaml.
So if Brisa doesn't support something out of the box, there's a good chance you can extend it with a plugin.
That's the idea. It makes Brisa incredibly versatile and future-proof. Plus, it gives the community a way to contribute to the framework in really meaningful ways.
Well, I think my brain is officially full. We've explored the depths of Brisa's reactivity model, dissected its server components, unlocked the mysteries of web components, and even peeked at its unique approach to forms and its super extensible plugin system.
And we're not done yet.
All right, welcome back to our Brisa adventure. So far, we've covered a lot of ground. Those super efficient signals, the web components that can jump between frameworks, it's been a wild ride.
And now we're going to see how all those pieces fit together when you actually build real-world applications. And first up on our list is routing.
Ah, yes, routing, the virtual pathways that guide users through our apps. So how does Brisa handle that? Complex configuration files, custom middleware, what are we talking?
Actually, Brisa keeps it refreshingly simple. It uses a file system-based routing approach, similar to Next.js, actually.
Oh, I like that. Convention over configuration.
Exactly. Your page's directory structure basically becomes your site's roots. Create a file called, say, contact.tsx, and boom, you've got a contact page.
I see, I see. But what about those cases where you need a bit more flexibility? Like, let's say you're building an e-commerce site with hundreds of product pages. You're not going to create a separate file for each product, are you?
Of course not. That's where dynamic routes come in. Brisa lets you use these dynamic segments in your route definitions. You just wrap a folder's name in square brackets. So for a product details page, you might have a folder named productid.tsx.
Ah, clever. So the route would dynamically match any product ID. Very cool. Okay, let's talk about something that always gives me a headache. Internationalization. Building apps for a global audience can feel like juggling chainsaw sometimes.
I hear ya. But Brisa actually makes I-18. That's internationalization for short. Surprisingly manageable.
Okay, good.
And it goes way beyond just translating text. Brisa handles language detection, routing based on the user's locale.
Whoa, hold on. So if I have a site that needs to support English, Spanish, and maybe even Klingon, Brisa can automatically route users to the right language version.
Exactly. You just define your supported locales, and Brisa takes care of the routing magic based on the user's browser settings. It even gives you a handy function to access translations within your component so you don't have to mess around with complex logic.
That's a lifesaver.
Yeah.
Okay, last question. Deployment. We built this amazing Brisa app. It's multilingual, it's blazing fast.
Yeah.
How do we get it out into the world for everyone to see?
Deployment is pretty straightforward with Brisa. You've got options. You can do the traditional server-side rendering approach, or if your app doesn't need server-side logic, you can deploy it as a static site.
Static site. So for something like a simple blog or portfolio, I could just get all those static site benefits,
Yeah.
speed, security, ease of hosting.
Exactly. Brisa has built-in support for generating static sites. It'll pre-render all your pages into static HTML files, ready to go.
And for more complex apps that need a server running behind the scenes, what are our options there?
Brisa runs on Bun.js. You can deploy it to any platform that supports Bun. It's a really flexible runtime. And to make things even easier, Brisa has these adapters for popular serverless platforms like Vercel and Netlify.
So whether I prefer a traditional server or the whole serverless thing, Brisa has me covered.
Exactly. It all comes back to that Brisa philosophy of giving developers power and flexibility, no trying to lock you into one specific way of doing things.
Well, I gotta say, I'm seriously impressed with Brisa. It's performant, it's feature-rich, it's developer-friendly, and it's really pushing the boundaries of what we can do on the web.
Agreed. It's a really exciting time to be a web developer, and Brisa is definitely a framework to keep your